I'm Lynn Brown, Executive Director of the Bradamus Center at NYU, which is pleased to bring this conversation to you this evening. My role is to set the stage very briefly about the Civility Project and then get out of the way to listen to our informed and interesting panelists. This is the third in the series of what we hope has been and will continue to be an enlightening and at times even provocative set of conversations on the topic of civility. Now, as we have already found from our two previous events, and will surely experience this evening as well, civility can be a slippery and changeable concept, depending on who is invoking it and how and to what end. Our first conversation confronted this reality head on. Entitled Interrogating Civility, we asked up front, is civility always a good thing? Whom does its exercise benefit and whom does it harm? What are its limits? In the second conversation, we turn to the role of civility in the political realm. How important is it in guiding political debate and behavior? What role does it play in maintaining the functioning, the good functioning of our political institutions and in the very protection of democratic norms? Our panelists on that session offered a pretty highly pessimistic view of what they saw as the breakdown of the norms of collegiality and comity among elected officials at all levels of government, which really hinder policy making, making it difficult, if not impossible. Tonight, we turn to trying to locate the place of civility in efforts to achieve social justice. In this context, confronting entrenched power structures, often to bring about social change, the role of civility may be seen as an even more precarious concept. Some might say that the norms of civility are too easily invoked to hinder protest and free speech. And what of the role of civil disobedience to mobilize actors and shape public opinion? Just last week, in an op-ed in the New York Times, Roxane Gaye, entitled the piece, "Don't Talk to Me About Civility," posed very starkly the question, is civility really only an excuse to ask people to remain silent in the face of injustice? So that's what's up tonight. The Bradamus Center has taken on this project because of its mission and the legacy of our founder, John Bradamus, who served as a member of the US Congress for 20 years and then served as president of NYU for over a decade. In Washington, DC, John was a fierce partisan and advocate for many causes, but he was deeply, deeply devoted to the legislative process and to the prospect that reasoned discourse could be had across a wide political spectrum. And as president of NYU, he thought that one of the roles of universities, among other things, was to provide a space for such reasoned and reflective discourse. I want to thank the J.M. Kaplan Fund and many members of the Center's Advisory Council for their financial support for this project. One of the members of the Advisory Council, Ellen Toscano, has also been a mainstay in helping us put this together in terms of both the concepts and the speakers. And also a shout out to Michael Denicia, Tom McIntyre, Nessa Rappaport, and Polly Terzane, who can put together all of this in terms of both content and logistics. Now let me introduce your moderator, who will go on to introduce the panelists, of whom we have quite a thoughtful and talented group tonight. Julie Fernandes is Associate Director for Democracy at the Rockefeller Family Fund. Before joining the fund, she served as Advocacy Director for Voting Rights and Democracy at the Open Society Foundation and served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division at DOJ under President Obama. And for good measure, also Special Assistant for Domestic Policy in the Clinton administration. And she served as Senior Counsel at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, at which time she led that coalition's successful campaign to reauthorize the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So you can see Julie is very comfortable in this space of intersection of law, advocacy, policy development, and philanthropy. So I turn it to Julie and to the panelists, and stay tuned. Fasten your seatbelts for what I hope is a good conversation.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for your invitation to come here and moderate this panel on this very timely and important topic for policy and for our body politic. I'm going to give it just a few introductory remarks, just my reflection when I was thinking about this panel and what we're going to be talking about. And then we'll have presentations from our amazing panel that I'll introduce at the time. And we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. And so please put your questions in the Q&A box. You can, if you don't see it at the bottom right of your screen, then click more. And then you'll see the Q&A box and you can put your questions in there. So why this focus on civility? And this may have come up, I'm sure it did in the previous webinars around this, but I was thinking about this, about the focus on civility and whether people talk about civility in public life as a way to virtue signal. Is it a rhetorical tactic designed in the policy realm to disarm opponents? What are we trying to protect? And as Lynn kind of suggested a second ago, what are we trying to suppress? Of course, in politics, whether or not one thinks a protest or discourse is civil is likely heavily influenced by whether or not you agree with what the protesters or the speaker is angry about. George Floyd protests, January 6th. Anger seems justified if you feel a just cause. In politics and policy, passion matters. Is the demonization of passion a tool for suppression? An interesting question that I think our panelists will touch on here is whether uncivil conduct brings people in or repels them. Or does it depend? Does civility work to promote social change and social progress? Do we need it to move forward as a community, as a democracy? When I think about this, I do remember that some people are really angry, and they're really angry for good reason. The people in Minnesota and around the world were angry after they saw the murder of George Floyd. Did the protests against the actions of the police officers in Minnesota, did they need to be civil in order for them to prompt change? And if so, why? Anger was an appropriate response. And in some ways, does a drive to towards civility actually delegitimize that anger and then make people feel like they're not being heard? People who don't have power often need to see that people with power understand that they're angry. So how does that happen? Another question is whether there's something intrinsically good about being civil, about civil discourse, civil protest. Are we harmed by the negativity? Is it kind of like a cancer on us? Is it just tearing us apart, even if it's not necessarily the way that we get policy more done? Is it bad for us to demonize other people that we have political disagreements with? But then I think, shouldn't some people be demonized because they're demons? Does not calling out demons for what they are perpetuating, isn't that itself somewhat immoral? Do we undermine our legitimacy by pretending that demons are just people we disagree with? We don't say that person lied, we say, I don't agree. But what if they lied? And maybe it's important to say what's true. And maybe just because of what I've done in my time in Washington, a lot of this, I think about George Floyd, I think about January 6th, I think about Brett Kavanaugh. Remember Brett Kavanaugh? Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh lost his mind at his confirmation hearing. That's just what happened. He yelled at senators. He was disdainful. He was disrespectful, particularly of Amy Klobuchar and the other female senators. He displayed the most uncivil conduct ever for a nominee in any position. And yet, he was a hero. And he brought others with him. And now he's a Supreme Court justice. So what of civility? Or Who, for whom is civility some kind of a test of whether or not you're just leading with your emotions or you have a brain? Who must be civil and who doesn't need to be? So perhaps what was good for Brett Kavanaugh is bad for America, maybe. And of course, it suggests something also that, suggested, is the drive for civility just a way to make marginalized people feel less powerful? Question. Let's get to our presenters, because I'm just a spectator of this. Let's get to our folks. So we have three amazing people here today. We have Larry Cohen, who's the board chair of Our Revolution, the former president of the Communications Workers of America, and many other things. We have their bios that I think Polly is putting in the Q&A, or you have it in your Zoom. We have Gaye Theresa Johnson, Associate Director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies and Associate Professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies and African American Studies at UCLA. And then we have Charlton McIlwain, Vice Provost for Faculty Engagement and Development and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. We're going to go in reverse alphabetical order. And then after the presentations, we'll have time for questions. So Charlton, if you would kick us off.
Indeed. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. And I kind of wanted to just stop with your demons comment and call it a day. I think that sums it up very well. But this question about civility has been kind of looming in my sort of atmosphere for a while. These questions about its role in political life and so forth. And I've largely stayed away from engaging it or articulating and answer to it and so forth. And so when I was first asked to be on this panel, my first knee-jerk reaction and my thought was, civility is for suckers. And that was the first thing that came to mind. When I started to sit down and consider this question about civility in today's politics, it struck me as a foregone conclusion that the concept of civility is dying, if not already dead, and this is as it should be. Defined and used today, civility is a set of conventions that prescribe the proper way to engage in public discourse, politeness, mutual respect, seeing the world from another's perspective, listening, decorum, disagreeing with grace and a smile. These are the hallmarks of civility, but the truth of the matter is that none of these define what is possible or promoted in our current media or political environment. None of these describe what takes place in town halls across the United States, where rants about the evils of critical race theory run rampant. None of these terms reflect the words of recalcitrant politicians that can so easily and willingly look into the face of an unbelievably tragic school shooting and respond immediately and unequivocally with a resounding, we need not do anything differently. And so we must come to grips with the possibility that civility is dead. And we must face the fact that it is and always has been an illusion. And so I say civility is for suckers because both our present and our past history about social change, about protest, about mass political action demonstrate to us time and again that civility is simply the card that those in power play when the masses of people threaten that power. Civility is full of false equivalencies, like when in the aftermath of Charlottesville, a president could say that there are some very fine people on both sides of a line on which white supremacists stand on one side. A hollow notion of civility is what gave us such bankrupt policies like a fairness doctrine, now resurrected in our current network news and opinion environment, that once suggested that every viewpoint, every voice, every rant, screed, diatribe of misinformation or disinformation be heard, distributed, engaged, and reckoned with. And so when we move from the domain of speech to the domain of collective action, notions of civility once birthed a notion of civil disobedience, a conundrum and contradiction that only state power has the straight face to articulate and enforce. For civil disobedience isn't disobedient at all. It is obedience. It is when you agree to disagree, or agree to disagree by playing by a set of rules dictated by those who have power and whose adherence to which do not threaten and even help to sustain that power. And so when your collective actions are a real threat, they call you something else, which is a civic disorder, and respond by commencing to setting you straight, manufacturing your consent, your obedience, your subservience. And so, yes, your speech is free, and so long as it is spoken within the confines of civil behavior or civil procedures, it will buy you nothing in the way of changing the status quo, of shifting power, or giving the historically disenfranchised greater access to it. And so I know that thus far, all of this might sound like a collection of non sequiturs, but I make these seemingly disconnected points to advance a specific point about the role of civility in public life. And that is to say that it is only when the state and those with access to power recognize the havoc that incivility, the incivility of their concentration and maintenance of power wreaks on the masses, that social change is possible. To put it differently and more clearly, if civility is a domain for domination, for the maintenance of power, for the persistence of the status quo, then it is incivility that drives social change. And so shifting gears a bit, I want to speak more specifically about civility and social change in the context of racial justice activism, and more specifically to say a few words about it in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives, the collective efforts to seek and attain justice for people in communities of color. In thinking about civility, it struck me that Black Lives Matter had been so successful in part because it recognized that not only is today's concept of civility morally and civically bankrupt, but that it has always been so and was designed to be so. Before I proceed, let me take a moment to take stock of that movement's success. In one instance, not since the late 1960s has the issue of race writ large or issues of racial injustice in the criminal justice system been on the list of US citizens' top concerns until the year and years following the articulation of Black Lives Matter as both a concept, a rallying cry for collective action and organization, and a set of policy prescriptions. These issues have stayed atop the public agenda in a more sustained way than any of the high-profile racial issues that plagued us throughout the 70s and 80s, the 90s, or the early 2000s. There is more, but I will leave that to suffice as two markers of Black Lives Matter's civic success. But in the years that I focused myself and my research on thinking about Black Lives Matter activists and activism, I was struck by their strident desire to separate themselves from previous generations of civil rights leaders. Why did they do this? Because they rightly recognized that their parents' and grandparents' civil rights revolution was framed by civility. They recognized that it was mired in respectability politics and propelled by the notion of playing by the rules as dictated by those who were only willing to bend them so far, mired in patriarchal notions of hierarchy and power that built and sustained white supremacy. Sure, they got some things done. In fact, some very important things like the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, an end to formalized segregation and Jim Crow, increased but still inadequate racial representation in Congress and in state and local government. But it didn't get us enough to keep that same system of power and the same people who wielded it from continuing to discriminate against Black and Brown people in education and employment and housing and in economic opportunity, or from policing and criminalizing our communities at every turn. And so the generation that coined cancel culture took hold of all that Black Lives Matter stood for, and they were successful because they were so relentless in their incivility. Who can forget the Black Lives Matter activists who stormed the stages of presidential candidates from Hillary Clinton to Bernie Sanders, Mitt Romney, and Donald Trump to demand that they be listened to demand that they say the words out loud, Black Lives Matter, to demand recognition of the persistent violence that our criminal justice system perpetuates against communities of color. And who can forget the results that followed? More articulated words in the Democratic Party platform in 2016 than has ever been articulated on issues of race and racial justice. Same for the Republican Party, though to a comparatively less degree. And more articulated and specific policy proposals to address issues of police violence and systemic racism than we have seen in recent decades. Who can forget the activists who marched on streets along those who threw garbage cans through store windows and sent Molotov cocktails sailing into police cars? They stood alongside, donning bandanas and gas masks, knowing that state power, that police power, would not distinguish between them. Who can forget the many images in Ferguson and Baltimore, here in New York City, in Oakland and Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Washington, D.C., and more, where activists stood defiantly, hurling epithets, speaking truths about law enforcement complicity and sustaining racial violence in front of thick blue walls of cops armed with the latest military machinery, prepared to do what it took to keep their protests civil and in order. Black Lives Matter was powerful and successful because it leveraged the juxtapositions of state brutality and so-called citizen incivility through the millions of memes and mashups, the images of cold, dead Black and brown bodies alongside those that marched out of line, out of step, and out of order beyond the boundaries of police-sanctioned protest routes. They were successful because they used their voices and their cameras and their phones and their social media feeds in uncivil ways to capture, distribute, castigate the actions of police and politicians who insisted that Black Lives Matter's acts to render transparency is an affront to the privacy of government actors who sustain their power by working and lurking in the shadows. And so where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line between the level of incivility that propels a collective assault against entrenched power and what lies on the other side? Frankly, I don't know. But perhaps it is at the point where those in power, when it is those folks who are the ones who are expected to and who actually live up to their ideals of civility towards the masses, and do so enough so that it causes them to truly recognize us, to truly understand our position, to respectfully address us, hear our voices, and shift, relinquish, and share access to power, privilege, and opportunity, as well as freedom. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlton, for those very, for those great remarks, thought-provoking, and really, thank you. So I'm going to move on now to Gaye Theresa Johnson. Take it away, Gaye.
Thank you so much. And Charlton, thank you for those amazing comments. I'm going to offer a few here as well, largely probably an echo, but maybe also animate some other thoughts too. So first, thanks to everybody for having me and for the organizers of this. So we were given these core questions, and one of them was, where's the line in determining what an act is civil or not in confronting entrenched power structures? And like Charlton, I feel like there is no static line to determine what is civil. The line is arbitrarily applied by those in power, but the line can also be moved and shaped by marginalized groups. So even just the entire context that is set up around civility is not one that has been determined by people who are marginalized. And yet, because that's often all we have to work with, we have figured out a way to move and shape the conversation about what is civil and what is not. I believe that the idea of civility as it now exists is largely a conceit. And I felt the same way that Charlton did when I was asked, oh, what are you talking about civility? What does this mean? What kind of conversation are we going to have here? Because I was curious about what possibilities remain when the concept of civility is inextricable from its situated history and regimes of white settler power and thought. the promise of civility is extremely contingent, right? It depends on the assumption of humanity. It depends on the assumption that everyone has some at core humanness. And that's what makes the concept of civility limited. Because you first must be considered human to be invited into a shared agreement about what civility is and is not. The work of reproductive justice workers at this time, for example, with all of the, I mean, there's Roe v. Wade, but there's so many other policies and laws that people have been battling for years and years. And, you know, the questions are not just about whether or not someone has the right to an abortion, but the questions are also, when does a woman cease to be human? Why does a woman need to give birth in shackles? Why are poor women criminalized as people who are undeserving of choosing what they want to do with their bodies? There is no shared humanity in that kind of civility that is so linked for me to the picture of Kavanaugh losing his mind, as you said, Dr. Fernandes. That is, you know, civility in many respects is a source from elitist thought and behavior rather than some innate shared philosophy that a lot of folks would have us think it is. And with the recent shooting, which was today, the one I'm speaking of course, is in Uvalde, where all of these children are killed, and yet many of their parents are afraid to go to see what was happening because the Border Patrol was there, because ICE was there. And so where is the civility in the police showing up and not doing, where is the humanity? Where is the shared assumption of humanity? When did those communities cease to be human enough to be saved? The fact that the NRA then holds a rally and is supported by legislators, former presidents, entertainers, just down the road. When do we cease to be human beings? When we think about as Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter protests that Charlton mentioned, centered, not just the ways in which they have helped us to rethink what civility is, but also the ways that online harassment continues to plague its founders and its organizers, the way that especially queer and women of color are disproportionately subject to incivility behind closed doors. You can't go and burn a cross on somebody's lawn anymore, but you can do it every day on Instagram or through direct messaging on Twitter and not be held to account for it. So the entire sort of what has become, I think, a regime of civility is hostile to its own discovery as something that is based in deeply unjust practices. So when we think about what we're trading in or trading with, when we talk about our civility or incivility, we may as well throw it all out. This is my opinion, because if we don't redefine it or refuse it, then we're not redefining or refusing terms that are defined by mainly white supremacists and settler regimes. We have to ask the questions around where is civility, ideas of civility, where are they operating and within which frontiers? What are they managing? They have always been a denial of not just shared belonging and national belonging, but even of citizenship. They offer this promise of equality and justice and the sense of national solidarity that disallows a shared experience of national citizenship in a moment. Your sense of belonging, but also your very citizenship is in jeopardy if you, or your status as a visitor is in jeopardy if you are not civil. And that can be anything from the way that you raise your children, the amount of money that you have to provide them with the baby formula that they need. All of these kinds of rules that govern civility gather from insecurities about ungovernability, about unpredictability, about the function and form of Black and brown, queer, indigenous bodies. What is unpredictable, what is unknown, what is unforeseen is just simply not acceptable in the performance of any kind of supremacy, white or otherwise. However, there are, of course, histories of the use of civility by marginalized groups that instruct us in empowerment and humanity. So, for example, an insistence on civility that emerges from disenfranchised groups that asks a nation to make good on its promises about national belonging. This is what you wrote the check for. This is what we're asking you to cash. A lot of people have written about this. Surya Kant, Wagamore, Hugo Garinge also write about this most recently. And I think also movement leaders and here I'm speaking of organizers in particular are continuously reinvigorating public discourse about civility as an idea and a practice. And also reminding us that a more expansive set of relations is more than possible. It is already and always here. So in many respects, I'm not as interested in the limits of civility anymore, but rather like the lessons that we've learned from our wisdom in the moments when all we had was that option. And I think more public engagements between what appear to be unlikely allies, movements, prison abolition, land back, for example, they call into question the notion of civility itself as based first and foremost in European and settler colonial regimes of thought. So let me shift really quick and you'll tell me if I'm running out of time, Julie. A couple more minutes here. Okay. I'm an academic, you know, we get our verbal stroll on constantly. So I just lose all track. So what is the other question is, what is the power of civil disobedience to mobilize social actors and move public opinion? I think I've sort of started to touch on this, and I certainly can't repeat as eloquently as Charlton did the answer to this question. But I will say that I think that in this is also a politics of representation, is in many respects, people who have been disenfranchised or marginalized measure the success of a democracy by what it promises around civility. And I just want to expand on two ideas. One is about embodiment. And I'll share just quickly a couple of pictures that I think probably a lot of people have seen before. If you've read any of the coverage, you could see, oh, let's see. I wonder what you see. You must see these pictures here, right? Okay. Of people dancing during the protests about the murder of George Floyd, people dancing right in front of police lines, crumping, doing the electric slide. I'm just going up and down here so that you can see. But is this a form of incivility? Absolutely, but it's also something even more important, I think, which is a disruption of not just the somberness, but the deadly environment in which these people are protesting. Deadly, like it is a matter of life and death in this moment. You don't know if you'll come back alive from a protest such as this, but to embody these politics of expansion, to dance instead of to run, to dance instead of to curse, to dance instead of to be to match aggression with police, to give an expression outside the realm of the given context, remakes public conversations about freedom and humanity. And lastly, I want to say, and again, these are just offerings as sort of like food for thought, since we are short for time, is that we so rarely have the mic. So a lot of times we are arriving on a scene and expected to have all of the right answers and all of the right words in a moment of national crisis. But this kind of time is applied very differently to different people. Damien Sojourner's work talks about this. For people of color, time is serving time, is doing time, and not necessarily choosing how you spend your time, which is associated with whiteness and leisure often. And so when we think about big projects of expansion, we think about unending and limitless time. for some people and not for others. And this is really important for how civility is differently measured for different people. Is how much time do you have and what do you do with that time? Lastly, the presumption of human solitude in the conversation about civility, of a civility that is only human and not connected with all forms of life. Civility as only a human behavior, but also it's very much an assumption based in disconnection from other parts of the natural world. People like Robin Wall Kimmerer, Nick Estes, so many folks who are trying to remind us that a lot of people don't even see the plants or the land and understand the gifts that they give us. And so now I think I'm less interested in whether civility works or not, and more interested in the truths that are embodied in the resistive actions, but also the expansive actions of people who want to live in community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaye. This conversation is already so rich. I'm trying to take notes that I can have some great questions afterwards, and we haven't even heard from Larry yet. I want to remind everybody to please put questions in the Q&A. Go to the more thing in the bottom right, put your questions in Q&A, because I know you have them, or reflections that you want to just kind of have our panelists talk about. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Larry.
Okay, great. Great to be here. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Bradamus. Particular shout out to my friend David Bonnier, who's on the advisory council of Bradamus, who I think suggested me to participate. I can only say, David, that I'm thinking of you. And David, like John Bradamus, was the Democratic whip in the Congress and had to figure out what does civility mean in a Congress that was increasingly polarized, which I think overshadows a lot of what we're dealing with today, the political incivility, particularly of the Republican Party. They've made it an art. So this will be obvious, but I'm in the practitioner category, not a scholar in the least. Honored to be here with scholars. You know, I grew up in North Philadelphia at a time when the police commissioner was Frank Rizzo, who then became the mayor for 2 terms, Democratic Party. And firsthand as a teenager experienced the racism, and I called it even then fascism, of that city, and reminded people the rest of my life, this was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and not Philadelphia, Mississippi. And so for me and many other young people at that time who joined protest movements against police brutality that was horrific, I still remember well a demonstration at the Board of Education, high school kids, where Rizzo got out of his car and 50 police streamed out of their bus, and he said, "Get their black asses." We weren't all black. And they pulled out their clubs and beat the you know what out of us and killed a girl. And didn't intend to kill her, but she hit the pavement and died. And so again, that was my youth. That's what I experienced. On top of that, the brutality of the war in Vietnam. And I could go on and on, but this is not about me, except to say that for me, civil disobedience, which is in the title of this, was my life from the time of a teenager till today. And again, not bragging about this, but just indicating for me, civil disobedience, including mass arrest, has marked 50 years of my life since then. Around issues of police brutality, the war in Vietnam, the fighting apartheid in South Africa, arrested in the governor's office in New Jersey with religious leaders. I was a union leader at the time. When we told the governor we were going to stay there until he signed legislation ending investment in South Africa by any of the firms in the $30 billion state pension. In the world of work, arrested in the piston strike, supporting miners on Highway 50 in Kentucky. Arrested at the occupying the headquarters of NCR when AT&T, the biggest CWA employer, bought NCR, and there was no tolerance for union organizing there. We took over the headquarters until we were arrested and dragged out. And so I could go on and on. For me, it's more than 50 of these similar arrests. I would say nonviolent is critical. You know, I learned that throughout all these fights because number one, we're not there to protest. We're actually there to govern. We're actually there for social change, part of the framework today as well. And the real frame that we have to stay on is how do we win the changes that we heard Charlton ring out? How do we win those changes? And yes, at times it's passion, at times it's raising a voice, it's as if I'm even doing that now. But it's also by organizing and by organizing mass movements and by organizing not just those who already agree with us, but by being able to talk to, and I'm not as interested in, you know, how do members of Congress talk to each other? I don't really care. But how do we as working class people, black, brown, and white, talk to each other in America to build a mass movement that's going to change the very things that we almost all agree on need to be changed. And so I think that on the one hand, yes, protest, yes, civil disobedience, yes, dancing in the face of the police, yes, celebrating ourselves in all possible ways and confronting power with truth, but also with debate and change and building this mass movement that is very, very hard to build in this country, but never hopeless. And most importantly, I would say confronting the rules of this so-called democracy, not just the rulers. The rules have been flawed from the 18th century Constitution to today. Well, in the 18th century, you might objectively, in some ways, applaud that as a start against monarchy and autocracy, but not in the 21st century. And the question becomes, what are these rules that actually prevent real civil discourse, that prevent, as was said in the second Bradamus panel, that prevent majority rule? We do not have majority rule in this country. We have rules that prevent majority rule. We have rules that elect people based on a plurality, not on a majority. Easy to fix. Much of the world has fixed it. We have a judiciary. We heard about Kavanaugh, appointed for life. But as my friend Jeff Merkley, senator from Oregon, has said repeatedly, we have a judiciary that's a third legislature at the federal level. We have a judiciary that reviews laws that were passed like no other judiciary in the world. And there's no jury or anybody else involved. There's these judges that are like monarchs and autocrats that serve for life up through the Supreme Court. We have an electoral college that elects the president, not the popular majority. And so when Clinton wins by 3.5 million, she loses. We have a Senate that by its own nature is not democratic, with 2 senators from every state. But much worse than that, we might be able to rationalize that. We have Senate rules that in no way are democratic. And we still have to persuade even the Democratic caucus that the filibuster must go, that the filibuster is a product of racism derived from Jim Crow that created the filibuster. But it's not just racism. It's against workers. It's against immigrants. It's against the majority that wants to ban assault weapons in the face of murder after murder, not just in school in Uvalde or in a supermarket in Buffalo, but it's the entire lifetime of this kind of mass murder. And we had a ban on assault weapons. Why can't we bring it back? The Senate. Why can't we provide for reproductive rights for women? We have a majority. Why not? The Senate and the rules they have. Why can't we have rights like every other country in the world where workers have a right to organize on the job? The Senate. In 2010, we would have passed the Employee Free Choice Act. This year, we would have passed the Protect the Right to Organize Act. But again, the Senate does not operate based on majority rule. Ironically, it does not operate based on civility. Deliberately, those rules are based, they prevent matters from coming to the floor of the Senate by a supermajority of 60. So they don't even have the civility of discussion and debate in that Senate. And that's in fact what prevents majority from adopting these matters. It only takes a majority to pass a resolution or a bill, but it takes a supermajority to actually discuss it and debate it. There's no civility there whatsoever. I could go on and on with this list. But what I'm stressing here is it's the rules, not just the rulers. We have what I call candidate addiction. And in CWA, when I would give a talk, I would literally, like I was injecting heroin. We're addicted to the candidates that pay no attention to the rules on voting rights, the rules on how elections work, the rules even within inside the Democratic Party. At the same time that we decry money in politics, we allow millions of dollars to pour into Democratic primaries to elect candidates that agree with the rich and the powerful, the right wing, and then we have a court that, of course, says that money is speech. But even within the Democratic Party, we allow rules. And I was the vice chair of the Unity Reform Commission that looked at the rules about how we nominate presidents, that said no more superdelegates in the nominating process. That was an incredible battle. And yet today, that battle is being reheard in the Democratic Party itself. So we need to end candidate addiction. We need to focus on the rules, that as we build the movement for social change in any of these areas where all that we love is on the line, whether it's voting rights, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's banning assault weapons, whether it's something as simple as why do we pay 2 or 3 times for pharmaceuticals what every other country in the world pays, that at the same time that we organize around all these issues for economic and social justice, that we recognize that we need to change the rules so that we don't keep doing this one thing at a time, decades and decades, and building massive majorities and not majority rule. We need to fight for majority rule in America. And then civility may well work. The civility so that working class people can have these debates and even argue and even scream. But know that at the end of the day, it's our world and we can change it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you for all of that and for kind of grounding our conversation in part in sort of what is it that we're all talking about? What does it look like when we're able to have civil discourse, or I won't even say that, when we're able to have discourse where people can solve problems together, which is what you're saying. It's interesting when you were talking about the filibuster, because as you know, much of the rhetoric around preserving the filibuster is all about this idea of comedy. Oh, where are the good old days when we all used to, it's actually a perfect example of what we've all been talking about a bit, which is kind of like civility used as a cover for basically those who are in power to stop others from being able to have voice. Because the whole idea is we're having comedy together. We're having civilized conversation about laws. So that's why you can't have votes. Because civility doesn't allow for votes, because that would be somehow that's not how we do it. So I'm kind of interested in like the bringing it to the real. And I'll say also what I found so interesting in one of the ideas, and I want to get to other people want to put questions in the Q&A, but I have a couple questions myself from all of it. So first, I want to get back to you, Charlton, first. And you talked about incivility driving social change. So kind of throw out this idea that we need civility, because really what we need is disruption, or we need to not be kind of confined by a notion of civility in order for us to kind of get disruptive change. And when you think about that, what do you think about as, and you gave a little bit of a definition, I think, in your remarks, but what would you think is an example of that, or sort of what are the parameters of your notion of incivility that you think, you know what, sometimes that's what it's going to take for us to shake it up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in part, this is what some of Gaye's remarks and particularly those images spoke to. That is, there are rules for civil engagement, how you act, the path you walk, where you don't veer off the path. And so I think the incivility is thinking through what are the strategic ways to disrupt that and to get out of line, not so much for the purpose of the behavior itself, but for the purpose of what that signals, which is I'm not going to play by your rules because I know where that gets me. It gets me with
Right.
nothing and nowhere. And so I know and have the good sense that in order for you to recognize me and us and our collective position and our cry for change, there will have to be a crossing of that line that most people draw and paint for civility. So being incivil or uncivil is a necessity even for that recognition and that visibility.
I totally love that idea of incivility as signaling, I'm not playing by your rules. I
Right.
love that idea of like, so it's like, you know what, whatever rules you've constructed, those are your white supremacist rules.
Right.
Those are your rules of like, those are the rules for you, and which, as you were saying, Gaye, my humanity is even recognized in that construct. So you know what, I'm out.
Yep.
I have another way to go. And that's freedom. And people can see that as an authentic flag, you know, of I'm out, who's with me?
Right.
You know, I wanted to ask you, Gaye, about, you mentioned that examples of organizers utilizing civility as a practice. So utilizing civility, like, so you know what, owning it and having a practice of civility that they define. Can you elaborate on that? I thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't know what you meant by that, but it sounded interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. One is the way that people do play at the idea of civility as one that is completely exclusionary, again, of our humanity.
Right.
So in that way, even something like being extra polite, there's some writing on this, is a form of incivility. Even as it appears that you are engaging in civil conversation, there's a whole other subtext that's going on. But mainly what I meant was about a practice of humanity. And this is where I think people say and are very clear about what the truth is, which is just simply that these rules were not made for me.
Right.
They're not premise in anything that recognizes anything about my freedom and liberation. But not only that, it's not just about one group, but as Larry was talking about, everybody's freedom, everybody's ability to be recognized as a human being, as a worker, as anything, any part of their identity that makes them whole. So I think the practice that people are engaging in more expansively, and I think it's more interesting now, is one in which people are saying, I'm not doing any of that. I mean, you can call it what you want. You can call it civility, you can call, but what I'm doing is something that you can't even register. You can't even imagine, because people want to speak in other kinds of languages, sometimes that have nothing to do with words, but as I showed, are dancing, are practicing forms of humanity, like bringing people ice cream when they've lost family members, to gun violence. You can't do anything for people who have lost children. But you can bring them something you can sit in silence with them. That kind of solidarity, that people who want to claim that for civility will try to claim that for civility, but that's a humanity that's so far out of the realm of understanding of the people who define civility, that I don't know that we can even, I think people can refuse rightly that categorization.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like at some level, there's a question in the chat early on about how much are we as a society arguing over very different definitions of civility. And that kind of gets to what you were just suggesting, Gaye, like, being a civil person in some communities is, showing humanity to others in their loss. That's what civility is. It's not about it's not about how decorous your dialogue is, but it's, you're showing up for them. And so how much are we really just allowing this word to be defined and then used against us in a way that is so far from actually really a definition that's empowering for us as people, and as a community. There's another question that in the Q&A, it's not really a question. even though it has a question mark on it, because it says, so many want to play white games to win white prizes. How can we call these folks into the movement? I don't know, Charlton, you want to try that one?
That's an interesting way to put that. What I hear in that question is a little bit of what I think struck me by Larry's comments, which is the struggle being less about how do we correct the kind of incivility in corridors of power, and how do we become civil amongst ourselves in a ways that help us to organize and collectively act against power. And I think that rings true to the degree that there's so much of that division and so much of our history in which that divide and conquer is so much a part of the strategy for maintaining power. And I don't know, that sinking feeling of being amongst people that you and me are the same, but we find a way not to be able to talk to each other about a common set of interests. And so when I hear that statement, that's really what I'm hearing really is the power of Larry's word about that kind of collective civility amongst folks who disproportionately don't share or have access to that power.
Well, and that's the thing, right? That's the politics of division that makes people who actually could see each other's humanity and their shared fate not see that, because it's in other people's interest for them not to see that, not to see our linked fate as working people, very colorful rainbow of working people, and not seeing that as our defining humanity, so we can see each other.
Right.
So we can see each other.
Can I just jump in on that for a minute?
Absolutely, Larry.
So I think one of the powerful things about Occupy was the chant, and my friend Bernie took this up, the 99%. And Occupy was very much a protest movement, very much in the face and in the ways that Charlton and Gaye described it, including the dancing, etc., multicultural in many ways. But it also was, wait a minute, we're the 99%. And yet there's an elite out there, and it's fine to talk to them, and maybe we get their help once in a while. I don't expect it, but we have to be able to build those kind of communities, even artificial ones. And we have to be able to build that movement. And that does take civility among us. At the same time that we protest, get arrested, and are in the face of the people who abuse us.
I mean, I think that's right. I think it takes civility as defined as being able to see each other's shared humanity, not
That's
civility defined as a set of rules about what kind of words you can use or what kind of actions you can take that define what is respectable protest or respectable engagement or respectable discourse. So it's kind of like, and it gets back to, again, the sort of foundational question about what do we mean by civility? Do we mean a set of predetermined rules that have been created by folks that aren't me, created by sort of some power structure, and I have to conform with that? I got to put on my blue suit, I got to put on my pearls, I have to say the right words, and I can't get angry. I can't get angry, right? Because that certainly puts me, then I'm the angry Black woman, and that's not okay, right? So is that what we mean, or do we just mean seeing each other's shared humanity? Because I think we need that. There was one question in the chat that I was going to call out, but it's gone now, but it's so great because the question was, where are today's Larry Cohens? There's no answer to that, but I just had to call that out. That was a great Q&A question. Where are they, Larry? We'll have to get to that next time. Oh, there it is, it's back. So good, that's the question. But I want to we're running short, so I want to get to, there was another question here. Maybe you can all kind of jump in on this one. It was, I see civility as respect for individuals. From that perspective, isn't civility required by productive dialogue? Maybe required for productive dialogue. Maybe they mean that. But again, to me, this is just like a set of rules. That's what they mean by, so I don't know. Anyway, you all should answer. I'm not a panelist. Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I mean, one thing I will say is that I think what it calls into question is the ability to do just that. So I'll put it this way. I lived in Oklahoma for a lot of years, extremely conservative state, prided myself on being someone who I thought was civil, listening to the other side and so forth. And there came a time, and for me, it was basically the 2016 election, where I realized these folks, these conservative friends who for so long I thought of as individual people to whom and for whom I could share and understand their viewpoint of the world, simply were never going to see mine. Were never willing to see mine. We're never going to change. And so is it really then a necessity for us to push through in those circumstances to make others see, recognize us? I think not. I think those are the people at some point that simply are the folks that we have to say, you've got nothing for me.
Right. Yeah. Gaye?
Also, I was going to say, I mean, I think this sense of the individual it can be useful, but we all have communities. We're all caught up in the web of collectivity. And so if I respect you as an individual, but I don't also see you as someone who is part of the wave of people that are facing mass eviction, or the wave of people who are losing their rights daily, if I don't see you as someone who is losing your rights as an Amazon worker or never got them in the first place, if I don't see you, if I can see down the road where your community is going to end up if we keep on this road, then what we feel about individuals is like, it's important because in terms of everyday politeness, absolutely. It's important in terms of being open to hearing what someone has to say. But the main issue is the humanity of all people never being in question. So I would just
Right.
stop that.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of us after
Yeah.
2016 were done smiling and waving, Charlton. Yes, Larry?
But I would just say one last thing about that. Charlton's words really struck me because I felt that kind of thing a lot. And, I think it's fine. This is as an organizer to practice avoidance. Avoidance is a good strategy. It's a good defense mechanism. On the organizing front, meaning I'm not going to go engage with everybody, no matter if I'm black, white, brown, straight, queer. The nature of an organizing committee in a workplace that I help train people in for years is it takes all of us and then we split up who talks to who. That's what you would have heard in the details of the Amazon organizing in Staten Island. Everybody can't talk to everybody. There's no perfect organizer. And avoidance is fine too. But at the same time, objectively, we need to recognize how we are oppressed and how we build through civility. Again, doesn't mean we all can talk to everybody. I'm not volunteering for white supremacists either, but I can talk to most people, and I will volunteer. But it will take that mass movement of tens of millions of people to get the change that gives us what we all love and cherish.
Right.
There's no shortcut for it, and we got to fight to change the rules while we fight that oppression. The rules are not democracy. We don't have majority rule in this country.
I think my takeaway from a lot of this is that from what you all are saying is we have to be creative and expansive in our understanding of what we're even trying to do here, and not let some like artificial kind of artificial forms, artificial frameworks kind of cabin our creativity, because we're at a very dark place. We're at a very dark place in terms of our ability to be a functioning multiracial democracy. We've never been one, but we're about to slide even off where we've been. We're sliding off even this precarious kind of, maybe we're on the way to that place. And so we've got to do something. We need to be able to be free and creative and risk-taking and affirming of our people if we're going to get there, and not be caught up in, you better not do it that way. Then we just keep losing, my own opinion. So This has been so fun, friends. I want to give each of you like a last kind of 15 seconds because we're out of time, just to say if you want to leave folks with like a what next or a thought, hit it. I'm going to go reverse. I'll start with you, Larry.
It's hard, but not hopeless. We've got to organize. It doesn't have to be the only thing we do in the world, but we need a few minutes a week from each one of us. And we need to link the issues that we care most about to the rules that prevent us from changing anything.
Great. Gaye?
I'm a +1 to that party. I feel like that is what we need. We need people to not give up, people to understand that folks have persisted through much, much, much worse than what people have persisted and dreamed about freedom when they were 150 years from it. So we can't dishonor that. We have to think about the next generation.
Boom.
You have to think about what freedom means in 10 years, in 30 years, in 50 years. We don't live here in this moment alone.
I just got a chill from that one. Okay, Charlton.
Same, and to that I will add that we that power is the prize, and so resisting the notion to think through these kinds of concepts at the individual level as if it's really about how you and I as individuals deal with each other, and keep in mind that really it's about power, interrogating power, who has it, who has access to it, who's sharing and who is not. And that's really the way of moving forward. I can take your individual affront against me if I have access to power to make things change and possible for me and folks like me.
Boom. All right, that was fantastic. Thank you all so much for this completely thought-provoking, and I feel privileged to have been in this conversation with all three of you. So thank you very much to NYU, to the Bradamus Center, and I guess we'll have more. Sorry, I'm saying this. They're gonna have more programming in the fall, so check back in the fall. But thank you guys so much. You're just rock stars. Thank you so much.